Hello and welcome to the Moonshots Podcast. It's a very special episode 35. I'm your co-host, Mike Parsons, and as always, I'm joined by Chad Owen in New York. How are things, Chad Owen?
Great, Mike. Aside from some post-cold voice strangeness, things are going well. How's your morning been in Sydney?
Sydney is incredibly chilly this morning, but hey, it's winter. It's got to get cold at some point here in the usually sunny Sydney, Australia. I'm all warm. I am ready. In fact, I want to admit to all our listeners that I'm rather fired up for this show because, Chad, this is going to be the almighty, one of the greatest, most exciting shows we've ever done. Why don't you share with everyone the topic, the guru that we shall be diving into and delving into their world? Who is this very special innovator?
Yeah, well, we've been on an Apple kick here recently, and this Apple train is not over yet. Our last show was about Steve Wozniak, and this show we're going to be talking about the other Steve Jobs, co-founder of Apple, and the JC to all the Apple fanboys out there in the world.
Indeed. And, the funny thing about Steve is very complex guy, multi-dimensional, but I think we have to recognize that he has been at the head of not only one, but two companies. I think some of our listeners might not fully appreciate that Steve Jobs was not only founder and CEO of Apple, but he actually was the CEO of Pixar. And just as a reminder, Apple, super heavyweight champion of the technology field. Pixar, by far the most successful Hollywood studio in history. Their success per film, their earnings per film, far outperforms anybody else. And he was instrumental in both companies. I mean, if you had done one, you'd be very happy. But to have done two makes this a very special show. I mean, Chad, when you think about all the things Steve Jobs can mean, what does he mean most for you? What role has he played and his inventions played in your life?
Well, I did want to remind our listeners that we did a show on Ed Catmull, who's also there at the beginning of Pixar. So if you're curious about the early beginnings of Pixar, be sure to check out that show. That was show number.
That was a fair while ago, I think. I think Ed, I'm going to guess, was in the low 10s, somewhere around there. What do you think? Maybe 16, 15?
8. Show number 8.
That early.
And it was one of the early ones. We had a great guest on that show too, Simon Banks. So. But to answer your question, Mike, Steve, for me, is an innovator on two very interesting fronts. And I see him as an innovator on the kind of physical, creating amazing physical experiences with products. And on one side, and then pairing that with the software and the back-end UI and user experience together into products and services that we all take for granted today.
Right. Yeah. He was remarkable in blending hardware and software in a way that, Microsoft and many other companies have attempted to do, but no one's really come close. Let's be honest. I think the other thing I would just to add on top of that is he did all of those things, Chad, but can you think of someone that has disrupted so many industries? Like if you think about, he disrupted animated film, he disrupted the PC market, the phone market, he disrupted the music market, the software market. Like if you actually go through the list of things, his inventions are wildly disruptive. I mean, it's actually far greater than the Amazon effect. I mean, Steve Jobs messes with a lot of people's other businesses through the art of innovation. He's that disruptive.
His innovation. It's interesting you bring up Amazon. I believe that Steve Jobs' innovation model, if you will, is very different from Jeff Bezos's.
That's right.
Whereas we're always talking about the flywheel
Mm-hmm.
at Amazon. That's Jeff Bezos's kind of core thesis on innovation.
Right.
Whereas I think Steve Jobs is much more of a complete disruption, blue ocean, creating new markets,
Yes.
kind of innovation from whole cloth. Like taking a complete divergence from what has come before. Whereas Jeff Bezos I think it's still innovative, but it's much more tied to kind of the current reality and what customers' current needs and focuses are.
Absolutely, and the knock-on effects of all the innovation of Steve Jobs is just off the planet. Because I want to remind you that back in 2007, Apple was far from being the greatest smartphone manufacturer in the world. And in fact, a lot of people thought it was crazy that they were making a phone. But look at, in just such a short time, in just over 10 years, they make more profit per phone than the rest of the industry combined. They are truly a super heavyweight champion, if you will, when it comes to that. But the crazy thing, Chad, is he did this with Pixar too. Pixar is incredibly dominant in the animated film industry. And if you had said 15, 20 years ago that Disney was not going to be the dominant force in animated film, you would have been laughed out of the room. Ironically, they ended up acquiring Pixar. But I think the sheer scale and effect on business, on our personal lives, you cannot understate the impact of Steve Jobs. And I just think it's so exciting to delve into this world, because what happens is when they have this great disruption, it's not only a company. I would propose to you, Chad, it starts to become like a cultural force. It starts to become something bigger than a company. It's sort of, and you mentioned the fanboys and stuff like that, but really it becomes a way of life. It becomes a status symbol. It becomes to have meaning far beyond that of just a product. And one of the crazy things is it's not only their products that are permanently marked in our minds and hearts, but it's even their advertising. I mean, these where does it stop? There is just innovation all around Steve Jobs. It's quite remarkable, right?
Yeah, and rather than you and I go a little fanboy here and talking about Steve, I'd love to just jump right into the clips here, because we've got some really great ones. So I'll actually just start out with Steve doing a really great reading.
Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. While some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
Boom. I mean, there it is. So that was taken from their Crazy Ones TV ad. And that was part of a bigger campaign called Think Different, which is really the source of how we all perceive Apple today. And it was one of their greatest campaigns. The coolest thing is it was not their most successful one. There's one other that we will talk about later in the show, which was even more successful. And this speaks so much to the cultural crossover that Apple has. And I think, Chad, a lot of that came from the fact that Steve, as much as he was into technology and software and engineering, he was also a man of the arts. And I think that's what really stands him apart. He was, part art, part science. And I think that's why he's had such a cultural and business effect on the people he worked with, on our lives as consumers. And I think that he stands alone because he had that multidisciplinary characteristic. And Chad, I was just wondering, can you really think of many current tech CEOs that strike you for having both that art and science, that philosophy and engineering intersection? There's still very few, isn't there?
I'm not really sure that I know of any
Exactly
offhand. And I'm struck at the kind of prescience of Steve reading that, because this was in the early 2000s when this campaign?
No, a little bit before then.
So in the 90s. But at the time, he probably wasn't thinking, oh, well, I'm talking about myself, although maybe he included himself in the geniuses. But I think certainly today we would kind of lump him in with, for viewers that or listeners that haven't seen this, it's lots of imagery of just all of the greats, throughout time: Leonardo da Vinci, Einstein, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, all of those kind of greats. And I think, we could almost just insert a picture of Steve Jobs in there as well. But his deep curiosity and multidisciplinary thinking that you mentioned, Mike, I think is definitely part of what drove him and Apple to create the kinds of products that they did. Whereas
absolutely,
their contemporary companies like HP and others were solely focused on, we're building machines for engineers. And Steve was way ahead, thinking of how can we get graphics in here and typography and things, so that he could open it up to the world, of creativity, not just science and engineering.
I think the big takeout for us here is, as obsessed as we might like to be with a certain skill, Steve Jobs is a great showcase, a great argument for the breadth of perspective and a worldview that's not singular, but it's more diverse and inclusive, and takes in different ideas and almost contrarian things and mixes them all up. And I think that serendipity is where you get some real magic. And certainly someone that recognized the magic of Steve Jobs was, for many years, they were kind of on again, off again, friends, then enemies, or frenemies, however you want to say it. But Bill Gates, founder of Microsoft, has some really, great benefit of hindsight, because they worked together for more than 20 years in different capacities. And we've got this next clip, which is really going to take us back to the beginning of Apple. And it's going to refer to some of the really tremendous things that Apple did, not only of recent, but of the really early days. So let's now listen to Bill Gates talking about the beginning of Apple.
What Steve's done is quite phenomenal. If you look back to 1977, that Apple II computer, the idea that it would be a mass market machine, the bet that was made there by Apple uniquely, there were other people with products, but the idea that this could be an incredible, empowering phenomena, Apple pursued that dream. Then one of the most fun things we did was the Macintosh, and that was so risky. People may not remember that Apple really bet the company. Lisa hadn't done that well, and some people were saying, okay, that general approach wasn't good. But the team that Steve built, even within the company, to pursue that, even some days it felt a little ahead of its time. I don't remember that Twiggy disk drive.
128K.
Yeah.
The Twiggy disk drive, yes.
Steve gave a speech once, which is one of my favorites, where he talked about, in a certain sense, we build the products that we want to use ourselves. So he's really pursued that with incredible taste and elegance that has had a huge impact on the industry. And his ability to always come around and figure out where that next bet should be has been phenomenal. Apple literally was failing when Steve went back and reinfused the innovation and risk-taking that have been phenomenal. So the industry's benefited immensely from his work.
Yeah, there's so much in there from Bill on Steve. What's interesting to me is how Bill calls out a few of Steve's traits. One of them is this kind of editing ability of Steve's to kind of bring the company on back to build things that they should actually be building. And I think it's portrayed differently in different accounts, kind of depending on where you go to learn about how things were handled. And I understand that, certain products kind of have a more fraught history than others.
Yeah.
But, it's resulted in more successful, more widely spread, more innovative products.
Absolutely. Well, did you also hear the interesting crossover that he has with the Woz, building products that we wanted to use? And do you remember how in the Woz show, he was continuously talking about build for yourself. You are your customer. That's also very nicely tipping in to Martha Stewart, be your own customer. And that's how he rekindled, and frankly, he saved Apple by getting back to its roots of building products that, he wanted to use, things that he would be proud to share with his friends and family. And I think it's a big lesson for anyone building a product right now is build something that you desire, that you really want to use yourself. If you're not the customer, you're going to struggle deeply in having that empathy and understanding of what the customer really wants.
Yeah. And frankly, it's just, you're going to be spinning in circles for forever until you do have that kind of problem solution fit yourself before you can then go and test it on others. And Steve had a very, in hindsight, he calls it a great opportunity of coming back to the company. So he could be on the outside working at Next and founding Pixar and saying, oh, Apple's doing all of these things wrong. Here's how I would do it. And then he was actually, he actually was given and took that opportunity, seized that opportunity to come back and then again, build things that he actually wanted to use.
Yeah. And you have to remember too, that what he built at Next was essentially OS X. So the main thing that came back was a Unix-based operating system, which I don't know if you remember, Chad. After a lifetime on Windows, when I finally got on OS X, I was like, oh my gosh, it doesn't crash. It just doesn't crash. And do you remember Windows machines used to crash regularly back in the day? And
they still do.
It did. I mean, I really honestly can't even recall the last time my Mac has crashed. I know it's crashed once or twice, but in the last few years. But well, here's the thing, Chad. What's really interesting is when innovators and creators and product designers are their own customers, they get this strong mission about them, and they know what they're about on the inside, so that they can tell actually better stories on the outside. And what we're going to do now, and I promised this in the early part of the show, we're now going to talk about Apple's most famous ad. It's called the 1984 ad, made by my favorite film director, Ridley Scott. And this ad was an absolute game changer. It did a number of things. First of all, it's generally considered the most effective ad ever run because they paid for one placement of the ad. That placement was on the Super Bowl. And it was so controversial when it was aired in the halftime break that it set the world on fire. It was the real talking point after the game and for the days after. But here's the other thing. This ad was so powerful because it didn't talk about the product. It talked about the mission behind what Apple was doing and really set them up and really was the forebearer not only of Think Different, but it's this mega brand that the company's gone on to become. So we're going to listen to a guy called Lee Clow. He's from a very famous agency called TBWA, and they made the ad way back then in 1984. And what I want you to remember as we listen to this is that what we take for granted now is that halftime break in the Super Bowl is full of these very interesting, epic, multi-million-dollar ads. This all started with Apple, with their ad. They were the first to do this, and they started what is now a billion-dollar industry, which is Super Bowl advertising. So let's have a listen to Lee Clow telling the story behind this very iconic ad, 1984.
Today, 1 year after Lisa, we are introducing the third industry milestone product, Macintosh.
So there was this challenge from Steve. I got to introduce Macintosh. It's got to be dramatic. It's got to be famous. It's got to be different. We had a meeting where we presented a whole bunch of thinking that went into launching Macintosh. He thought it was brave. He thought it was great. It was the board of directors thinking it was really stupid and irresponsible. And there was a moment in time when the board was trying to pull the plug on all the funds and have it not run. And he was there with Wozniak, and he said, well, I'll pay for half of it if you will. They didn't have to come to that, but they did make that overture at one point. So you open on this place that represents the future, with people marching to a central hall. Our idea was that Big Brother represented the control of technology by the few. Lots of people decided, partly by the bluish quality, partly by the competitive situation Apple found themselves in, that Big Brother represented IBM. And that really wasn't the intent, but it probably worked on that level as well. But running down one of the corridors was a girl who you saw glimpses of. She came bursting into the back of the room, and she stopped and swung once, twice, and then heaved the hammer. And a giant explosion.
And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
1984 wasn't designed to only run on the Super Bowl. It was designed to have a media life beyond the Super Bowl, but the board of directors at Apple decided it was irresponsible, since it didn't show the product and the product wasn't even available yet, to continue running it. And that becomes almost part of the legend. Oh, and the genius of just running it once on the Super Bowl. Every news show the next morning was basically saying, the game was okay, but did you see the commercial? Our vision was more about the idea of how the world was going to change because of computers, not that we were changing the Super Bowl that day. But it did create a phenomenon where people started thinking, designing advertising specifically for the Super Bowl and keeping it secret and having it be a surprise. All those things were kind of born out of 1984 running once.
Yeah, I mean, I was born in 1984, but that ad still is one of my favorites. And one thing that's really stuck out to me is that the product is nowhere in the ad, and I don't know that did the Macintosh make it out by the end of 1984.
Well, it was famous because the not only was the product not in the ad, the product was not even available. But can you imagine the demand for it once it finally became? It had already become such a cultural phenomenon, and the product wasn't even out. Isn't that just? I mean, Lee Clow there, he admits that there was some, convenience in how it all played out, which might, in retrospect, look like a well-planned situation. But can you imagine that both Steves said, look, guys, we'll pay for this ad ourselves. We believe in it so much. Now, doesn't that tell you everything you need to know about two founders doing what's right?
Yeah. And again, Steve Jobs reaching into the multidisciplinary world to kind of have the foresight of going to someone like Ridley Scott and in collaboration with TBWA.
Yeah.
I don't know of many or any companies at that time that had done that in such a way. I mean, it is kind of like a short film that you're watching.
It is.
And I know it's inspired so many other kind of similar ads to this day. And of course, Apple is still known for its innovative ad campaigns and the way places products or not inside of its advertising.
Exactly. And it shows you, I love the conviction. I love the contrarian thinking. I mean, he's literally doing think different. They do it themselves. They did something that nobody at the time was doing. And it shows you the power of his strategy, the power of his thinking and his ideas, the way he was able to find opportunity through thinking differently to everybody else. He had the confidence and the courage to think different and to do bold and courageous things. And I think that's another thing that I think we can all take something from. I mean, that story from Lee Clow just confirms to me how courageous Steve Jobs was. Don't you feel that when you listen to that, Chad?
Yeah. Another thing that comes, Steve Jobs he did not lack conviction. And I think this ad shows his conviction for his positioning of Apple against all of the other players. Right. And you can kind of read some of the subtext and think, oh, well, this is a knock on IBM. But to Steve, I don't think it really mattered. He was just going so far afield and saying, we are so different and unique and only, for this kind of person, that it created this magnetism for everyone to flock to the Macintosh product. And that was, even more successful than the Apple II, which had been an extremely successful product, 5-6 years previous. So I think what this clip is teaching me is the value of choosing and owning a very kind of unique and different position amongst the rest of your competition. Because clearly, if you didn't think that Apple was different in no way like an IBM before this ad, after this ad, you're like, yeah, of course. Like, you want to root for Apple because Apple is, the woman that throws the hammer that breaks the screen, and everyone else are the corporate drones, inside the dystopian machine.
But let's build on that. I think you can only have that conviction if you are the customer, if you're working incredibly hard on solving problems that your customers face. I don't think you can buy that in. You know what I mean? You can't. It's got to be there. And I think that it's his thinking. It's this boldness that he has, which is really appealing. Now
big bets. Big bets. So in the same way that he was willing to put his own money and borrow from Steve as well into this 1984 ad after founding Pixar and pooling all with Ed Catmull and others, pulling all the resources behind the launch of Toy Story, the first animated feature. He essentially bets the company on the success of that feature. And so here's actually a great clip we have from Ed talking about what it was like working with Steve as Pixar was being prepared kind of unexpectedly for an IPO.
We're out trying to figure out how to make this movie, and we were a group, though, that had been through failures together. So we'd all experienced that, and it was really difficult to figure this out. And we made a lot of misestimates, and the first versions didn't work very well. But as we got closer, it became apparent that we were onto something really big. And I have to say, John Lasseter believed right from the minute that this is going to be gigantic. But from Disney's point of view, it was a boutique film. So they didn't put any consumer products behind it because they didn't see it being anything. But as we got into the last year, it was now apparent it was big. And so Steve said, okay, now we are going to revolutionize this industry. But we're also in a position where, because we've got the experience here, not only do we have the first film out, we will probably have the second film out before anybody else can get into this. But the deal that we had with Disney, frankly, was not a very good deal. We got like 3 to 5% of the profits or something like that. So it was not very good. Not very good. So Steve called John and me together, and he said, okay, our deal lasts for 3 pictures, and at the end, we're on our own. Michael Eisner will realize, as soon as this film is successful, that he will have just created his biggest nightmare. So he will not want the contract to end. So when the film comes out, he will renegotiate. And when we renegotiate, I want 50% of the profits. But if we get 50% of the profits, that means we have to put up 50% of the money. So in order for us to put up 50% of the money, we have to have the money in the bank. Therefore, we should go public. So John and I are saying, whoa, this is a little early here. Let's prove our worth first. But Steve, being Steve, had a compelling way about him. So we put on the road show. We went out and showed pieces of the movie. But what he told people as we went on the road show, so I went out with our CFO, went with us, Florence Levy, and Steve. And as we went out, the argument was that the company will go public 1 week after the movie opens. So you will see that we're changing the industry. And so that's the prep. So the movie comes out, it opens huge, it gets incredible reviews, and then the next week we go public. And it was the biggest IPO of the year. It was bigger than Netscape.
Incredible.
It was an incredible thing.
What a story. I mean, talk about bold faith. doing what you believe in. And Chad, just to frame this, they went IPO a week before their product launched. I mean, is that the most harebrained scheme you've ever heard of?
Well, a week after the product launches, and then they do their IPO a week after.
Oh, that's right. Just a week after your first product comes out. I mean, come on. But wasn't it brilliant for somebody who on one hand is crafting beautiful products, has the ability to think in terms of business strategy. He knows the terms of the contract with Eisner at Disney. He backwards engineers. He said, well, we don't want to be in that position. We're going to need half the money if we want half the profits. Let's IPO. And you could hear in Ed Catmull, wasn't he? Ed's just like, can you imagine Steve saying, hey guys, we're going to IPO the week after? And you can just see Ed going, what? Are you crazy? You could hear that just the boldness of this idea must have been earth-shattering. I mean, they must have been totally focused on the product. And then from left field, in comes Jobs, hey guys, we're going to IPO a week later. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah, and to put some numbers on it, so in today's dollars, Toy Story had an opening gross of $60 million, which for a first 3D animated film is pretty incredible. I mean, I know today's blockbusters have $150, $200 million releases, but way back in 95, that's a huge thing. But here's the kicker. So Toy Story grossed in 1995 $30 million. Pixar IPO'd the next week at a market cap of $1.5 billion.
Oh my gosh.
And of course, Jobs being the main founder of that company, I think he had somewhere around 80% of that stock. So, he was taking a huge risk and bet there.
Yeah.
But he had assembled, and if you really want the inside story, go back and listen to episode 8 with Ed Catmull. They had really created an amazing team of experts to pull this off. And they spent years creating Toy Story.
Yeah, and many failures before that, Chad. It's important to recognize they failed a lot before they got there.
But I think once Steve recognized what they really had, he was like, I'm all in. He pushed all of his chips out and it paid off.
And that is strangely reminiscent of what Musk did when both Tesla and I think was it Tesla and Solar City were both running out of cash, and he wrote his last check. He had no more money, and he just wrote the check.
Before that, when he infused cash into SpaceX to get their their successful launches, and he wrote the last of his PayPal money, and then they got the contract from NASA.
That's right, yeah. And I think, again, it all comes back to doing something that you love, solving a problem that you see, and just working like crazy on it. But what brilliant. So, I mean, contextually, it was bigger than Netscape. I remember when Netscape IPO'd in 96, everyone was like, the internet is here. So it was the biggest, shiniest internet stock IPO, and yet Pixar outperformed it. That's just how brilliant Steve's idea was, and created billions of dollars in value instantly, not only through the launch of the film, but the raising of the capital, which in the long term, Disney ended up buying back. Just a stunning story. I mean, and this is the history that we've just painted with all of these revolutions in terms of what they did, technology. I mean, we've talked about the Apple II and the Mac, but don't forget there was the iMac, the iPod. We talked about OS X, but also don't forget they have created the world's most beautiful retail stores, which are the world's most highest performing stores. They created iTunes, the iPhone, and so on and so on and so on. I mean, this is a tremendous history. And what's very exciting is for the second half of the show, we're going to start to get into how they actually did it. Mm-hmm. What are some of the ideas that lay in that success? Like, what are they doing? What are they thinking? How are they approaching the world to create so many blockbusters, whether it's at Pixar or Apple? All of it kind of comes back down to some philosophies and thinking of Steve Jobs. Whew. There's so much more to get into here.
Before we get there, though, Mike, I know that you have been fortunate enough to work your way through the Steve Jobs biography by Walter Isaacson, and so I wanted to bring back a segment of our show where we talk about interesting books relevant to our innovators. And just first, for anyone that has a passing interest in either the history of Apple or Steve Jobs as an innovator, would you recommend the book, and maybe what some of your favorite passages and or anecdotes were?
Yeah. I would say that this is definitely a book worth reading. It's right up there, I think. I think the way I would phrase this is I think this book is more helpful than the dramatization in the Steve Jobs film from 2015. That was pretty good, but I think what the book does is it really explores some of the complex relationships Steve has. I mean, man, he has a really complex personal life. He was abandoned as a child and adopted. You know, there are these themes that came out of the book that he had this famous thing called the reality distortion field, where he would just refuse to admit facts if they didn't subscribe to his worldview. It explores his pursuit of perfection. We've talked about the art and science and how he loved the Beatles and Bob Dylan. He loved design. I think so. It explores some of those themes really, really well. His artistry, and I think that one thing I think younger members of our audience probably don't remember, but before Steve Jobs came along, the technology world was these awful beige boxes. I'm talking about boxes that were like this off-white color, terrible looking monitors. And Steve came along and he said, look, I love the likes of, do you remember Dieter Rum's show? Very inspired by him. He brought good design into technology. It literally didn't exist in the category before then. And so the book really celebrates, you know, his love of design, you know, how to build product, and just he gave everything of himself to his products. I think one of the bitter twists of the book is that it sets up that he gave so much to his products that he really didn't put enough effort into his family. And one of the sad things the book touches on is, you know, he abandoned his own daughter in the same way that he was and tried to patch it up later. But, you know, very complex guy, gripping read. Walter Isaacson is very, very good writer, very famous writer. So you'd be doing very well just for inspiration and a good story to get into the book Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson.
Yeah, it's been on my Audible list for a long time. It's just I see the hours needed to invest in it, and just haven't had a chance to dig into it. Hopefully, with the stories we've heard about in the beginnings of Apple and the Apple II back in the 70s, and you know, Apple and Microsoft started just like a year or two apart. I think sometimes people forget that.
Right.
All the way up to the 1984 ad and the launch of the Macintosh, and even founding of an IPO of Pixar in the mid 90s. And as you've mentioned before, we've skipped over so many other things. You know, we could really just do a show on the individual innovations and product kind of accomplishments of Apple while Steve was there. But like you said, you know, we really want to dig into some of the strategy and ways that Steve operated Apple, so that we can get some takeaways and learn how to apply it to our own businesses. So the first clip we have in this next block is again, we have to take Steve at his own word. He did mention his reality distortion field. He's talking on stage with Bill Gates at a conference in 2007 about how he views Apple, specifically kind of in distinction to companies like Microsoft. So I'll just let him speak about what he sees as the secret of Apple.
If you look at the reason that the iPod exists and that Apple's in that marketplace, it's because these really great Japanese consumer electronics companies who kind of owned the portable music market for a long, invented it and owned it, couldn't do the appropriate software. couldn't conceive of and implement the appropriate software. Because an iPod's really just software. It's software in the iPod itself, it's software on the PC or the Mac, and it's software in the cloud for the store. And it's in a beautiful box, but it's software. If you look at what a Mac is, it's OS 10, right? It's in a beautiful box, but it's OS 10. And if you look at what an iPhone will hopefully be, it's software. And so the big secret about Apple, of course, not so big secret maybe, is that Apple views itself as a software company.
You may be fundamentally a software company, but you've been known, at least to your customers and to most journalists, as the company that kind of pays a lot of attention integrating software and hardware.
The way he frames the business as a software firm, it's you could argue this both ways, couldn't you, Chad? I mean, the truth be told is that the hardware is gorgeous. Equally, OS X is just the most robust, sturdy, never fail OS I've ever used, and I love it to death. We're both recording the show on OS X. I think he's teasing us a little bit here because it's yin and yang. They both work so well together, but the conviction.
I think he's kind of answering the chicken and the egg question here, or at least his perspective of, is it the software first or the hardware first? He's saying here, well, you need to have the compelling, oh my gosh, I have to have it software and experience side of things. And then like the icing on the cake is it's in a beautiful package. Yeah. And it's elegant and it's pretty and I want to show it off. Kind of thing.
What instantly comes to mind when you say that, Chad, is GoPro. What Jobs has laid out here, this is what GoPro should have done. GoPro was a neat bit of hardware with terrible software and got caught out massively. I think, everyone copied the hardware and then their point of difference really went away, didn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, because I think they weren't able to respond to, the clones, if you will, and the product experience behind the hardware. It wasn't there.
Yeah,
and so it was kind of a race to be commoditized very, very quickly. And so, this GoPro is the same as the Chinese knockoff, is the same as the Eastern European knockoff, etc.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what Jobs is bringing here is enormous clarity in the sequencing of things, the priority of things. In fact, one of the things when you listen to him, obviously he's a very good speaker, so he's quite convincing, but actually the content of often what he says demonstrates not only conviction, but enormous clarity and foresight in what he should do, what he shouldn't do. You'll often hear him talking about, well, that's not our business. They've been very deliberate in not making mistakes many tech companies have made in trying to get into content and services. Like they know which side of the bread is buttered for them and they stick to it. And I think this also comes true when he talks about when you build and when you partner. So let's have a listen now to Steve talking about this idea of when to partner instead of building.
We don't think one company can do everything. So you've got to partner with people that are really good at stuff. Like we're not, maybe Microsoft is great at search. We're not trying to be great at search. So we partner with people that are great at search. And we don't know how to do maps on the back end. We know how to do the best maps client in the world, but we don't know how to do the back end. So we partner with people that know how to do the back end. And what we want to do is be that consumer's device and that consumer's experience wrapped around all this information and things we can deliver to them in a wonderful user interface, in a coherent product. And so in some cases, we have to do more work than others. In the case of iTunes, there wasn't a music delivery service that was any good, and we had to do one, so we'll do one. But in other cases, there's companies doing a way better job because we're not as good at this stuff as other people are, and we'd love to partner with them. And so, we selectively do that. And I think it's really hard for one company to do everything.
Yeah, there's Steve kind of going back to the management greats like Peter Drucker and this idea of core competencies and really staying in your lane and doing what you're best at, and then having strategic partnerships to leverage. And then but place the really big bets when you have to, or when you're well positioned to. It's not to say that you don't try anything new because you don't want to, but it's kind of like pick the best opportunity. Don't just try everything. Or as he says at the end, don't try to be the best at everything because you'll be good at nothing.
Yeah. This really reminds me, Chad, talking about this is I think Yahoo is a great case study of a company that could have listened more to Steve on this partner instead of build. Don't you think? Don't you think that was a company that just spread itself across so many things? You're just like, what business are you not in, right?
Yeah, in the same way that AOL did too.
Exactly. That's a great, that was even a forerunner, which makes the whole Yahoo thing even more of a crime because you're like, guys, did you just not learn from what AOL just did? But here's the interesting thing. There was this very famous memo wrote, and it was called, I think it was the peanut butter memo. Yahoo. Yes. The Peanut Butter Manifesto. So this guy, Brad Garlinghouse, wrote this memo way back in the day, 2006, and said, hey, everyone, we're not doing what Steve Jobs is talking about here. We're trying to do little bits of everything, and we're doing none of them well. And this is exactly what Steve Jobs is talking about. He didn't want to do anything badly. So he was willing to decide to cut back functionality on a device. He was willing to get out of or stay out of different businesses in order to focus. And I think AOL, Yahoo are all examples of companies that didn't know when to partner instead of build. They invested loads of cash, got themselves into heaps of problems. And this really speaks to understanding market dynamics. I mean, don't you get the feeling, Chad, that the map in Steve Jobs' mind of where everyone fitted in the ecosystem was like razor sharp? Like he knew exactly how everything was moving.
Yeah, and I think it was very simple I think he could keep in his mind's eye what Apple's focus was at each point in its history, going all the way back to the Apple I and the Apple II computers. It's like going to have a low-cost computer that engineers and programmers can write their own programs for, which was, again, very innovative at that time. And that's all they did was just build that thing. And I think if you look at each new product category that has spun out of Apple, it's a very similar thing. It's the hyper focus positioned against all other alternatives in such an effective way that I think really just increases the chances that it will be successful in the marketplace.
Absolutely. And this next clip we've got just speaks to how he understands all those machinations and how he was very contrarian to how others thought about Apple. Like people would all have a common philosophy about how Apple works, whether it was only for elite people or whether it was in this massive rivalry with Microsoft, but he saw things differently. So let's actually listen to him break things down. And this is going back in history a while, but it's very powerful thinking here on the fallacy of zero-sum dynamics within competition.
Apple was in very serious trouble. And what was really clear was that if the game was a zero-sum game where for Apple to win, Microsoft had to lose, then Apple was going to lose. But a lot of people's heads were still in that place.
Why was that from your perspective?
Well, a lot of people's heads were in that place at Apple, and even in the customer base, because Apple had invented a lot of this stuff, and Microsoft was being successful, and Apple wasn't, and there was jealousy and this and that. There was just a lot of reasons for it that don't matter. But the net result of it was there were too many people at Apple and in the Apple ecosystem playing the game of, for Apple to win, Microsoft has to lose. And it was clear that you didn't have to play that game because Apple wasn't going to beat Microsoft. Apple didn't have to beat Microsoft. Apple had to remember who Apple was because it had forgotten who Apple was. And so to me, it was pretty essential to break that paradigm.
It's clear he's talking here in 2007 when Microsoft was a much bigger company than Apple at the time. But it's very clear that you can see Steve Jobs not taking that zero-sum point of view, going all the way back to the founding of the company. I don't think Steve ever saw what they were doing at Apple as taking away from other companies, and vice versa. I don't think he saw what companies like IBM and HP and Microsoft were doing as necessarily taking away from Apple. And I think the biggest lesson for me is like, that is so freeing. Like if you just understand that, like, that it's not a zero-sum game and it's not a dog-eat-dog kind of world, you're like, oh, wait a minute. Like, yes, you need to be abreast of what's going on, but you don't have to feel threatened or cornered or vulnerable about the competition. I think that's why he was able to take such huge bets.
Yeah. And it feels like when you work in an environment around Steve Jobs, whether it's at Pixar or at Apple, that it feels like ideas are the currency of discussion. And whether it's product ideas or business ideas, to me, I think it's refreshing and it's a big reminder to all of us that we sometimes get so charged up and so we work so hard on our businesses in the day-to-day that we get in the weeds and we forget to ask some of those bigger questions and discuss bigger ideas because we're just so busy executing. But don't you get the sense as we're getting into this that this is all about ideas for Steve Jobs?
Yes, the freedom and the curiosity to come up with the ideas and test the ideas and not care like what the other people are doing. Which is funny because
yes, that's probably the biggest thing to try and resist. The group think, and the classic thing that happens in business categories is everybody behaves to what we call the category norm. So if everyone in the detergent industry does it with a certain way or does retailing or advertising in a certain way, over time everyone starts to copy each other and it becomes...
it all reverts to the mean.
Yeah.
And everything becomes the same, and then everyone are the blue corporate drones in the 1984 ad, right? Yeah. And so you actually found a great clip kind of talking about this freedom and flow of ideas and autonomy that exists inside of Apple and how that's contributed to its success.
One of the keys to Apple is Apple's an incredibly collaborative company. And so... You know how many committees we have at Apple?
No.
0. We have no committees.
No committees.
We are organized like a startup. One person's in charge of iPhone OS software. One person's in charge of Mac hardware. One person's in charge of iPhone hardware engineering. Another person's in charge of worldwide marketing. Another person's in charge of operations. We're organized like a startup. We're the biggest startup on the planet. And we all meet for 3 hours once a week, and we talk about everything we're doing, the whole business. And there's tremendous teamwork at the top of the company, which filters down to tremendous teamwork throughout the company. And teamwork is dependent on trusting the other folks to come through with their part without watching them all the time, but trusting that they're going to come through with their parts. And that's what we do really well. And we're great at figuring out how to divide things up into these great teams that we have and all work on the same thing, touch bases frequently, and bring it all together into a product. We do that really well. And so what I do all day is meet with teams of people and work on ideas and solve problems to make new products, to make new marketing programs, whatever it is.
And are people willing to tell you you're wrong?
Yeah.
I mean, other than snarky journalists. I mean, people that work for you.
Oh, yeah. No, we have wonderful arguments.
And do you win them all? Or?
Oh, no, I wish I did. Oh, see, you can't. If you want to hire great people and have them stay working for you, you have to let them make a lot of decisions, and you have to be run by ideas, not hierarchy. The best ideas have to win. So, otherwise, good people don't stay.
But you must be more than a facilitator who runs meetings. You obviously contribute your own ideas.
I contribute ideas, sure. Well, why would I be there if I didn't?
Mm-hmm. Why would I be there if I didn't contribute ideas? I just love this idea of you cannot even dream of having the best people in the world if you're not going to have the freedom to explore and to live by big ideas. I think that was a very interesting relationship he drew there. If you want great people, not only do you need a great mission, but you need to give the freedom for the ideas on how you're going to make that come to life. You have to give incredible freedom to celebrate. And I even love the fact that he's like, we argue about ideas. And I've seen in my experience, if that's done well, if really frank, candid discussion can happen around ideas, it makes them better. And you really start to feel that he's crafting those conversations all the time, don't you?
Yeah. And I'd be very curious how it actually is or was inside of Apple at the time and is today. But I think what this is reinforcing for me is the importance of the diversity of input to get the ideas. And I really do think that the best companies are, diverse and inclusive and transparent so that all perspectives and everyone's ideas can get kind of into the hopper, if you will.
Yeah.
And then at that point, you have the furious, intense debate, kind of backed by the things that you and I love, like rapid prototyping and working closely with customers, et cetera.
Yes.
And then giving the teams the autonomy to just go do it.
Exactly. The one thing I want to add to your formula there is like you just get a crazy bunch of people together, diverse and interesting. But the one thing I want to stress is that if they don't feel the safety to share wild, wacky, crazy ideas, it can be as diverse as you like. But if everyone's in a state of fear, it ain't going to work. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And I'm sure that if we could look at many products that have come out of Apple, and if just one idea didn't make it, I think it could have broken, that product or service. Like everything that was put into the iPhone, like, his kind of famous reveal of it's an iPod, a camera, he just like keep web browser, phone, if one of those things was kind of left out, and I'm sure it was, Lucy in the back that was like, what if we like stick maps and navigation onto this thing? And
well, the famous one, Chad, was that he wasn't into the App Store. It wasn't until Gen 3 that the App Store came, and it was actually the team came to him and said, "We got to have an App Store." Isn't that amazing? A huge $1 billion business now, iTunes, the whole thing. It's, the thing is as much as it is about ideas, it's also about people. And what's interesting is so far we've heard quite a lot of conversation about ideas, breakthrough strategies, but he started to allude then, I thought it was really important that he attached that great people only come if they can work on great ideas. And I think that's really important takeaway for us and to remind ourselves of is you cannot be the one guy with or girl with all the ideas and everyone else is executing. I think it's very clear that even Steve's like, yeah, even I don't get it right all the time.
Yeah, and we've got another really good clip, really just to hear in Steve's words. He talked about in the last clip, I just go and meet with teams all across the company to get things done. And so here's some more about his philosophy on how he's brought together the right people to execute on those ideas.
My model of business is the Beatles. They were four very talented guys who kept each other's kind of negative tendencies in check. They balanced each other, and the sum was greater than the total was greater than the sum of the parts. And that's how I see business. Great things in business are never done by one person. They're done by a team of people, and we've got that here at Pixar, and we've got that at Apple as well. And so that's what lets me do this. Well, with the Beatles, when they were together, they did truly brilliant, innovative work. And when they split up, they did good work, but it was never the same. And I see business that way too. It's really always a team.
Yeah, a lot to discuss here. I think what's really interesting is, successful companies, you will often find there's two founders. You'll often find that there's this very early team that sticks around that, and I love this idea of modeling it off the Beatles. And they often have formative years. There's like a correlation. If you look in history, all these great sporting teams, music bands, business teams, they all had their equivalent of starting off in the garage for a year or two where the bonds came together. But I just honestly cannot enforce enough. Everybody listening, and Chad, from from me to you, one of the things I observe in the world is that great products can only be built by great teams. You cannot build a great product if there's not a great team. It just will not happen. Do you see this in your world when you're working? Can you see, like, basically great teams equals great work? Does this come true for you?
Yeah, I have to work at this every week. To surround myself with the best collaborators, both on my side and the client side, to be sure that our creative vision comes to light. And I think Steve he's had many different partnerships over the years, both in co-founding Apple and co-founding Pixar. He does a pretty good job of shining the light on the teams that are doing the work. I mean, yes, he does get up there and present, the reveal on stage. But I think, at least in my exposure to him, he does a really good job of calling out the teams that make the products and the services possible. And I think it's because, as he's told us here, it's like it doesn't get done unless you're working like the Beatles.
Well, half the thing is, nobody can present as well as him. So you kind of, even if it was your idea, you'd want him to present your idea because he'll do it much better than anyone else.
Yeah. And we could do probably a whole show on, the storytelling and presentation techniques of the keynotes over the years. I know that I've definitely cribbed and stolen a few ideas from the way he presents things. Definitely.
Well, the nice thing is that a part of his whole thing is preparation. He was apparently famous for massive amounts of preparation.
Yeah, and in the Steve Jobs movie that you called out, starring Michael Fassbender, you definitely see that, because the kind of storytelling frame is you only see everything play out in the preparation for different launches over the course of Apple and Steve's history. So you only get these kind of small windows into what's happening, like right before he goes on stage, and you see him, yelling at people about projectors and faulty prototypes and spotlights and all those kinds of things. So he's definitely a stickler for details when it comes to that.
Yeah, but again, that was never done until Steve Jobs came along. Nobody presented like a Hollywood showcase. Nobody,
and
did
everyone's
that.
Copying them now. Yeah, everyone.
Yeah, exactly. Oh my gosh! So just I'm recapping in my brain here. I mean, clarity on he knows what business he's in. He knows the dynamics between partners and competitors, and he's not just small-minded, stealing a little bit from this person to that person. He sees the bigger picture. Very powerful. I love this. I love the idea. I mean, for me, this is sort of heaven. Companies run by ideas. I think that's very exciting. And the fact that he sees that it's not all about him, I think that was the big transformation that he had. He towards the end of his career, as Ed Catmull alluded to, is he really started to understand the human behavioral dynamics of companies, and he really saw that great teams equals great work. I mean, what a onslaught of ideas and inspiration and wisdom. Ugh. I mean, it's exhausting. There's so much, Chad.
Yeah. Well, I think we are going to have to do something a little unprecedented for the podcast here, Mike. Mm-hmm. I'm sitting here looking at a list of like a dozen more clips from Steve.
It sounds like we have to go into the forbidden dark of a part 2 show.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, there's so many great things that we've already learned, whether it's kind of Steve's conviction and positioning and kind of audacity, to launch an ad like 1984 when they're launching the Macintosh. Or I actually really enjoyed him talking about how competition doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. And if you don't see it that way, you actually have more freedom to do more with things. But we have so many more clips on probably what many of you are looking to learn most is what are Steve's thoughts on innovation, how to innovate.
Yes. How did he do it?
Yeah, exactly. And I know that many of you probably have some favorite inspirational quotes or philosophical quotes from Steve, because he had some interesting views on life and the way he both developed and learned as a young man, and also kind of as he was in his later years and after his diagnosis for cancer, kind of reflecting on his life and whatnot. He also has lots of really interesting perspective and things to share with us. So that's just part of what we have in store for part deux of the Steve Jobs show.
Absolutely. I mean, we've got great thoughts around. We're going to hear from the CEO of Nike. We got great stories from him. We're going to hear from Larry Ellison, from Steve himself, and I think it's going to be the innovation piece. So how he created the products and the things that he did, and what we can actually use ourselves. I think also what I like about the second show is we're going to have a lot on his sort of philosophies. And both of those two topics are going to work nicely against the history and the strategy that we've heard about today. And I mean, I'm so excited to do that next show, but we're also very keen to hear from everybody what they liked about not only Steve Jobs, but about the Apple series so far. We are going to do this second Steve Jobs show. We'll follow that up with a Tim Cook show. And we might even do a bit of a recap, because as you might remember, we had our Jonathan Ive show way back in the day in our designer series. Just so many amazing people at one company, such a rich history, such influence on business and culture. I just really love this confidence and conviction to go and do things that are different to others. I mean, it was really the Think Different show for me today. What about you, Chad?
Yeah, I mean, you got my brain going all, through Angela Aren's show and Steve Wozniak and Johnny Ive, and we've still got Tim Cook to come, another second half of the Steve Jobs show. It's been really fun to take a deep dive into a company with such a storied history, so many successes, with some failures too, but certainly no lack of lessons to be learned from all of these people and what they've done at Apple. So I'm really excited for potentially 3 more shows as we kind of complete our tour to date of all the happenings inside of Apple.
Absolutely. I just want to encourage everyone who's listening to send us feedback. Just go to moonshots.io and you'll find everything about the show. You'll find the show notes, the links. Everything's going to be there. You can listen to the archive, catch up on some of our content and blogs. So that's moonshots.io. Chad, I just want to thank you for being part of this epic Apple series. I'm just it's so energizing getting so much inspiration from just one person. It's remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah, we sat down with a list of so many clips, and I think we realized pretty quickly we were going to have to split this up into 2 shows. But I think if it was going to happen for anyone, it was going to happen with Steve.
Exactly. Well, thanks for all of your ideas, contributions, your wizardry with all the audio production technology, Chad. It's so great to do this with you and with our listeners too. And how would you most like to hear back from our listeners, Chad?
I would like anyone that is listening that has gotten at least, hopefully, one nugget of insight that you've applied to your day-to-day, to stop on by the iTunes store and just leave us a review. 5 stars if you think it's worth it. But I love seeing the new reviews pop up there, and that, of course, helps other aspiring entrepreneurs and innovators come across the show.
Absolutely. So reach out to us at the iTunes store. It's the Moonshots Podcast. This is halfway through Steve Jobs, but it's the end of show 35. A big thank you to you, Chad, and everybody listening. We'll be back soon with the Moonshots Podcast. Take care. We'll catch you next time. And that's a wrap.